have your attention and welcome you to the club for our Wednesday night evening program on a Tuesday because of Songkran coming up, so we brought it one day forward. We had an astonishing program last week, as you may know, on the young Thai politicians, 4 of them emerging onto the political scene. It was one of the most unusual panel discussions on Thai politics in the last 4 years, since 2014, and stimulated extraordinary interest. We've had 4,500 hits on our website, and normally programs, good ones, go up to 1,000 or so. That's in just 4 days. The all-time record was the American ambassador when he misspoke in the club and got attacked by everybody, and he got about 5,500 hits over a much longer period. But it's attracted a lot of interest in the Thai media as well. So Voice TV is reporting that they've had 1.7 million hits in the last week. I'm not sure if it can be believed, but that's what they're reporting anyway. So that was a huge evening, and we had 260 people here. And at one point, I was worried that the floor might actually collapse around the bar. But anyway, we need more evenings like that, and we need lots of variety in our programs. We've been trying to do this particular program for a very long time. It's extremely hard to find people who can speak on North Korea. Anyway, before we kick off, just a few items of housekeeping. Firstly, the club will be closed on April 12th, April 13th, and also the 16th. It says here in observance of Songkran. I think it means in celebration of Songkran. We have a major exhibition opening on the 20th. That's a Friday. That's about the Mekong River. And let's see who is exhibiting. Yes, our photographers are Nicholas Axelrod and Thomas Cristofoletti. It's climate of change and dams, changing life's landscape of the Mekong River. The Mekong River is probably the single biggest security issue in the whole of Southeast Asia. It feeds Vietnam in the Mekong Delta. It feeds Cambodia in the Tonle Sap. So if anything goes wrong with the Mekong, we will have a huge problem. It's probably a bigger issue than the South China Sea. So that's an exhibition well worth watching. We also have on the May the 31st a presentation by Italian writers in Bangkok. Since 2012, a dozen Italian writers in Bangkok have published 20 new books, mostly in Italian, some in English, so you can read them. Both in print and in e-book format. Anyway, they'll be getting together and using the club to let you know more about themselves. And then next week, we have a program on motorcycles, the politics of the motorcycle cabbies who run up and down all the sois in Bangkok, and it's based on a thesis by an Italian academic who's currently at Oxford. And it hasn't got publicity yet, so I'll get that rectified tomorrow, but that's well worth attending. And then finally, a documentary, Landfill Harmonic, which has been delayed, which tells the timeless tale of the transformative power of music, while highlighting two of the most prominent problems of our times, child poverty and waste pollution. Okay, so that's enough. And so to this evening, as I said, we've been trying to do a North Korea program for ages, because this country is endlessly mysterious, difficult to understand, totally elusive. It's very, very difficult to find people not only who have anything to say, but actually who are willing to discuss it, because it has its consequences both inside and outside the country. So this evening we have James Chottier, who's a former career diplomat and a fellow of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He directed political and economic diplomacy at the Canadian embassies in South Korea, Thailand, and the Philippines, and also served as at Canada's permanent mission to the United Nations in New York. He was accredited to North Korea and led 4 Canadian diplomatic delegations to Pyongyang in 2015 and 2016. He also served as a diplomatic liaison officer to the UN forces in South Korea. And we also have Philip Hines, who's been here before talking about the security situation in Mindanao and southern Philippines. He's the head of political risk and analysis for ISS Risk and leads a team that analyzes and researches security and terrorism threats throughout Asia. He's a frequent visitor to North Korea and has also undertaken investigations, due diligence, background checks, and threat and risk assessments in China, Mongolia, Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines, Bangladesh, India, and even Hong Kong. I should think Hong Kong was the easiest of those. But he served for 10 years in the British Army, specializing in counterterrorism, intelligence, and communications, and was involved in the historic Northern Ireland peace process in the 1990s. So anyway, we'll kick off with you, James, if you don't mind. Okay. And I think you're going to give us a historical perspective on North Korea.
Well, some of the issues the background to North Korea and the current situation, and then some thinking on the possible outcomes of the famed summit between Trump and Kim. So well, I wanted to thank you and thank the FCCT first of all for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity, as I've been a member off and on since 1983. During the 7 years we lived in Thailand, we were members here and regular guests at other times since when we lived elsewhere in Asia. As Dominic said, my last assignment was directing political and economic diplomacy at the Canadian Embassy in Seoul, and as he mentioned, I led at that time 4 diplomatic missions to North Korea in 2015 and 2016. One of the primary goals of the missions to North Korea was the release of a Canadian prisoner we had there, Pastor Hoon Soo Lim. I attended his trial with the Swedish ambassador, who's our protecting power in North Korea, and we were the first diplomats and possibly the first foreigners to ever attend a criminal trial in North Korea. And Pastor Lim was released in 2017. In the course of my visits to North Korea, I had lengthy discussions with North Korean officials about a wide range of subjects, including human rights and other matters of concern to the international community. In all those discussions, however disagreeable the issues may have been to my North Korean interlocutors, they were always very civil, prepared, ready to listen at length and engage in dialogue. We disagreed often and forcefully, but always came back for further discussion and further visits. So I have 10 brief sort of comments to make, more or less brief, to make in response to some of the issues raised in the description of the program, sort of background comments, and 3 short comments about actions of the various actors, namely North Korea, South Korea, and the United States leading up to the Trump-Kim summit, and then 5 possible outcomes that I see as possible for the Kim-Trump summit. So first of all, a few comments. First of all, contrary to popular misconception, Kim Jong-un and the North Korean leadership is not irrational. On the contrary, they are coldly rational and committed to regime survival by making North Korea a nuclear weapons state. Incidentally, the U.S. military considers North Korea to be a rational actor on the international scene. Second, Kim is firmly in control of his regime. I mention that because for a couple of years after he came into power, there were questions about who pulled the strings in North Korea. Well, no one asks those questions anymore. Third, externally, Kim has pursued his aim of making a nuclear weapons state and bet that he could do so before the economy was crushed by sanctions. Fourth, in his systematic series of nuclear and missile tests, he's perfected North Korea's nuclear capacity and strengthened his own hand for negotiations. As we know, I think from the wide reporting, North Korea may soon be capable of delivering nuclear-armed missiles to the continental USA, though the accuracy of such weapons remains problematic. And however, achieving that capability should not presume a first strike intention. And fifth, despite Kim's rhetorical brinkmanship, North Korea views its nuclear weapons capacity as a deterrent, not as a means to launch some suicidal strike resulting in its own destruction. The North Koreans are not jihadists seeking some afterlife. The regime genuinely fears the massive military exercises undertaken regularly in South Korea. Six, for Kim, nuclear weapons are not a bargaining chip to be negotiated away, as they were perhaps for his father. The only remote possibility for this would be at a price that would probably be politically unacceptable to the US and its allies. For Kim, basically nuclear weapons are key to his survival. He's learned the lessons of Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi. What happens when WMDs are bargained away? And Trump's inclination to tear up the Iran deal certainly reinforces this lesson. Seventh, we should not forget that pursuant to his own Youngjin policy, Kim has another major goal other than achieving his nuclear weapons capacity. Since coming to power, he has repeatedly promised economic benefits to his population. To do that requires economic growth, and according to actually South Korea's Bank of Korea, GDP in North Korea actually grew by 3.9% in 2016. However, to maintain that, or to get that again and raise the living standards of the population, he has to get sanctions eased. The eighth thing, and a very important point, is that there is no good military option for the US. A major preemptive strike on North Korea would result in a retaliatory attack on South Korea, on Seoul, and possibly beyond, with the death of hundreds of thousands of Koreans, billions of dollars of damage in South Korea, and the risk of a full-scale war. North Korea has thousands of conventional artillery pieces camouflaged in mountains within 60 kilometers of Seoul. It's very unlikely that American and South Korean bombers could destroy these batteries before they had laid waste to much of Seoul. So despite Donald Trump's rhetoric, he has the same limited military options as his predecessors. And I noted that the New York Times, for instance, today referred to Syria as exposing the limits of the diplomacy of bluster. And I think that a lot of times that description is apt for the Korean situation. Recently in Washington, there's been a lot of talk about the so-called bloody nose option, whereby the US would strike at missile sites and a limited number of other targets in North Korea, with the assumption that Kim would recognize this as a limited attack and would not strike back. I think such an assumption would be dangerous, reckless, and extremely risky. Ironically, the advocate for the bloody nose option was none other than former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, who has now been replaced by the even more hawkish John Bolton. Ninth, China will only pressure North Korea to the extent that this does not result in regime collapse. And 10th, there was always going to be an impasse as long as the US insisted on a precondition, namely a verifiable and irreversible commitment to denuclearization before talks could begin. So those are just some comments that I wanted to make about the background to the North Korean story. In regards to the shifts that we've seen since January with North Korea, South Korea, and the US. First, North Korea. There is a combination of factors led Kim Jong-un to propose discussions with the South Koreans and ultimately with the US. Nuclear weapons were never the end in and of themselves, but they were meant to guarantee, as I mentioned before, regime survival. Kim had to balance the achievement of nuclear deterrence and the extent to which this strengthened his hand at the bargaining table against the toll that sanctions were taking on the North Korean economy. I think there should be no mistake about this. Kim in 2018 finds himself exactly where he wants to be, at the negotiations table with the US. And to me, if success in bargaining is defined as getting what you want and making your opponent think it is his idea, then it seems to me Kim's achievement of talks with the US is already a success. In this respect, he found a willing partner with South Korean President Moon, who not only was committed to dialogue with the North Koreans, but was alarmed at the rhetoric from Washington. And the Winter Olympics provided an opportunity for this diplomacy to go forward. And President Moon seized the opportunity offered by Kim and ran with it. As far as the US was concerned, faced by a fait accompli between Moon and Kim, Trump administration went along skeptically and reluctantly, and you saw the grudging response initially by Pence when he went to the Winter Olympics. But it's negotiations with the U.S., which has always been the big goal of Kim and his father before him. To have bilateral discussions with the President of the United States would provide credibility and recognition to the regime, both internally and internationally. For this reason, actually, successive U.S. administrations have refused to engage in negotiations, even at officials level, without a complete, verifiable, and irreversible commitment from the North Koreans to denuclearization. What North Korea is actually offering to the Trump administration is what it has proposed to past administrations, a willingness to discuss denuclearization in return for a security guarantee for North Korea. It's the security guarantee part which the North Koreans mentioned to the South Koreans, which always seems to be dropped from the coverage of the Trump-Kim upcoming summit. North Korea told South Korean envoys when they went to North Korea would not need nuclear weapons if military threats towards the North are cleared and the security of the regime is guaranteed. In 2005, North Korea actually promised to abandon nuclear weapons and existing nuclear programs in return for security guarantees. And this has been the basis for all previous negotiations with the U.S. in the past. And North Korea has indicated that security, and they've defined security guarantees, which mean, in their definition, the departure of U.S. forces from the Korean Peninsula and the end of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the U.S. and South Korea. As a sweetener to this approach to the Trump administration, North Korea committed to suspending their tests in the lead up to the discussions. The bottom line is that North Korea may be willing to talk about denuclearization, but it will not be willing to act except at an unacceptable cost to the U.S. and South Korea. So in accepting the North Korean proposal to meet, Donald Trump swept away years of diplomatic practice and policy, surprising his own advisors, South Korea and North Korea. In doing so, he not only disposed of the U.S. precondition, but gave away a major bargaining chip, which was a meeting at presidential level. That's always been the major bargaining chip with the North Koreans, and he gave it away for free. So why did Trump agree? I suspect it was a combination of impulsiveness, ego, reality TV view of the world, his knee-jerk obsession with doing the opposite of his predecessors, and his conviction that he is a master negotiator and deal maker and can out-bargain Kim when they get to the table. So what are the possible outcomes for this meeting if it actually occurs? Because it's not guaranteed that it will actually take place. I would suggest 5 possible outcomes for the summit. Some more likely than others. In law school, I was always, one of my first lessons was the difference between possibility, plausibility, and probability. So these are 5 possible outcomes. The first one is what I would call the do no harm outcome, that the two sides have an amiable photo op and agree on further discussions at the level of officials on various subjects, including denuclearization, release of the 3 American prisoners who are being held in North Korea, and the search for U.S. military remains. If I can just do a little sidebar on the U.S. military remains issues. 7,000 U.S. soldiers remain unaccounted for from the Korean War. Their remains, they are dead, but their remains are in North Korea. And for several years, actually, during the Clinton, the Bush, and the Obama administrations overlapping, there was cooperation between American military and the Korean military to find these remains. That was suspended a few years ago. So that is something that I'm sure is going to be high on the agenda of this meeting. So that's the first, the do no harm outcome. The second possible outcome I see is what I would call the do no harm plus outcome. So that's based on the idea that Trump will need more than a do no harm outcome. He's going to have to show his skills as a deal maker, and he needs a win. And Kim knows this. So Kim, meanwhile, will be happy to have had the meeting in the first place and may be satisfied that he needs no more missile and nuclear tests for the time being. So I would call that the do no harm outcome could be beefed up to a do no harm plus by an agreement to continuing the suspension of tests, along with the denuclearization discussions, the release of the American prisoners, and the resumption of the search for the U.S. military remains, perhaps in return for the easing of sanctions. The third possible outcome, I would say, would be a deal whereby, in return for some general denuclearization commitment and other concessions from Kim, such as the suspension of the tests, Trump could entertain North Korean demands for the withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea. Such a result would alarm South Korea, Japan, and U.S. experts, and would be fiercely opposed by Defense Secretary Mattis and all the top advisors around Trump. However, it is not unprecedented. Jimmy Carter favored this when he was president, prompting South Korea to move towards developing its own nuclear weapons before Carter himself backed down. And Trump has complained in the past about the cost of maintaining U.S. troops in South Korea, though in fact the South Koreans pay for the U.S. troops in South Korea. Fourth is what I call a full Bolton outcome, ending with stalemate after Trump demands a complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization, or at least some verifiable and irreversible steps towards it. In this scenario, Trump gives an ultimatum and offers nothing in return. Expectations of North Korea accepting some sort of complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization are unrealistic. Moreover, a genuine commitment would be very difficult to verify and would require huge and politically unacceptable concessions by the U.S., including, as I mentioned before, withdrawal of U.S. troops from the peninsula, renunciation of the Mutual Defense Treaty, complete lifting of sanctions, economic assistance, and the conclusion of a peace treaty, in addition to security assurances and diplomatic recognition. The fifth one, and which is the worst case scenario, which I would call the full Bolton plus, would be a meeting that ends, the ultimatum is delivered, the meeting ends in insults and threats with acrimony, followed by military preparations. This would certainly alarm South Korea and Japan, as well as China, be of great concern to the international community. A meeting ended by Trump in this way, followed by renewed military threats, could put a severe strain on the U.S.-South Korean alliance and cause China and Russia to reconsider their support for sanctions. I think South Korea and Japan fear kind of the two extremes. They fear both inappropriate concessions by Trump, and they fear breakdown of talks, leading to renewed emphasis on military options. So then we have I think that when you get these two leaders together, one of the things that we'll see is Kim. I should back up a moment and say that the North Koreans are very savvy about what's going on in the world, and this president, like other presidents, but more so, is really an open book. And so they will have studied him, they will have studied his negotiating techniques. He will try to manipulate Trump using charm, flattery, appeals to his vanity, tactics that have proved successful for other leaders dealing with Trump. The actual outcome of the meeting could be a combination of the possible outlines that I've described. Kim knows that he needs to give something to Trump, so Trump can proclaim a victory. Whatever he gives, it will not be a firm path towards complete, verifiable, and irreversible denuclearization. So a plausible scenario that I would see would be the following, where Trump claims, and you can see the White House claiming the following achievements from the summit, proclaims victory and a deal. First, they would say sanctions and threat brought Kim to the table, overlooking the fact that being at that table had always been a major North Korean policy goal. Second thing they would say is Kim has agreed to discuss denuclearization and suspend his tests. He's agreed to free U.S. prisoners. He's agreed to cooperate and search for U.S. military remains in North Korea. In return, Kim gets some easing of sanctions, a possible toning down of the military exercises in the South, and an increase in status and legitimacy from getting the meeting in the first place. I would say there's a great deal of unrealistic expectations which can result from this unrealistic expectations about this meeting and what the results will be. And that can easily be followed by disillusionment and anger. I mean, one thinks of the negative reaction to Mexico when they didn't build that wall. Right? So you think on 11th of March, Trump said, I think North Korea is going to go very well. I think we will have tremendous success. We have a lot of support. The promise is they wouldn't be shooting off missiles in the meantime, and they're looking to denuke. So that'd be great. He repeated basically the same thing yesterday in his sort of public remarks. So I will leave the Philip's been to China recently, so I'll leave Philip to talk about the Chinese reaction. But I would just say, perhaps in regards to the title of this session, which was, I think, Breakthrough or Abyss. So a general observation, it depends how breakthrough is defined. If it is defined as an irreversible, verifiable commitment to denuclearization, then there's not going to be any breakthrough. If it's defined as something less, for instance, a dialogue, a give and take by the two sides, then there might be what is termed a breakthrough. I think there is a reasonable chance the two sides will settle even on an interim basis as something less than their absolutist positions, and hence step away from the abyss. I think the more the two sides are inflexible, the more risk there is, but there are also constraints on the two sides. On the North Korean side, they want the easing of sanctions. On the American side, there are various factors weighing on Trump, including South Korean concerns about military action on the North, concerns about China's reaction, and the limited military options that are actually available. And there are concerns about the wider world and his preoccupation with other issues such as Syria, which has just erupted again, and Iran, and not to mention domestic concerns regarding the midterm elections and the various investigations. So I think that there are restraints on sort of what Trump will do. So I would say that whether the short answer to whether it's sort of a breakthrough or an abyss, I would just, I think, go with Zhou Enlai and his comments about the French Revolution. Too soon to tell at this point for that. Okay.
Right, well, you're full of good cheer. So, Phil, why don't you?
Is this working?
Yeah, it's working.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight, Dominic and Gwen Robinson, who originally asked me to come and speak. Just a bit of context, my experience and exposure in North Korea, I've been operating in and out of the country for approximately 12 years now. Probably somewhere in the region of 25 trips, and with an acceleration over the past 5 or 6 years in terms of the number of trips. Mostly working on geopolitical, analytical work pertaining to the country. We've very much taken a boots on the ground approach to understanding the problem that we're trying to analyze. So I was going to agree with James probably about 90% before we sat down here, but I'm probably dropped about 75 to 80% at the moment on the basis of what he said. I do have some fundamental disagreements there, but largely I agree with a lot of what he said. I was going to work off a script and everything tonight, but to speak about North Korea when you spend time in the country and you have interest in the country, it's quite challenging and difficult. There's a lot of people out there who actually do spend time in the country, and they're quite professional about what they do, their understanding of it, but they're not prepared to speak about it because the exposure to them and their contacts in the country, it creates difficulties for them, and it's unnecessary risk. I have a very good relationship at a sort of government level in terms of what we do and our understanding of it, and I'm going to really deal with the past 6 years in terms of discussion here tonight, and looking at the developments that have taken place since Kim Jong-un came to power. And I certainly agree with James's point about the irrationality of the North Korean thinking, their strategic planning, their forward-looking economic developments and everything. I've watched the economy not so much develop in a particularly strong way, but it's been a gradual development. It's been a stabilization process taking place since Kim came to power. He had a critical objective of stabilizing the economy rather than necessarily growing it exponentially. But that was also linked to the nuclearization program. The two of them worked in tandem, which then became his like bespoke policy. Like his father and his grandfather before him had their policies. His was one of economic development in tandem with nuclearization. The problem they've faced in the past 2 years, particularly 18 months more so, actually, was not quite knowing what was coming after Obama administration. And the more we get into the US elections and the more likely it looked that the unlikely was going to happen, that Trump would be elected, that created a problem for North Koreans, because I kind of like described the situation for the past 20 years as being North Korea has been sitting at a high roller poker table, bluffing. And up until the point in time when Trump came to power, nobody wanted to call their bluff. When Trump walked up the table with his attitude, the North Koreans suddenly were faced with a situation whereby they couldn't predict what he was going to do. So therefore they had to react to it. And in the past 18 months particularly, we've had an acceleration of both the nuclear program but also the missile program. Now the interesting aspect of that is that we knew their nuclear capability was there. What was missing before that was reach and capability to strike potentially America. So they accelerated their missile development program. And in the past 9 to 12 months particularly, well, actually not the last 9, since December last year back to like April, March of 2017, the integration of the various components of technology pertaining to enhanced engine capabilities, solid fuel, nose-cone re-entry, that's what they were developing on enhancement. And the launches we saw last year was the culmination of that coming together. The missing link to that was the application of a miniaturized nuclear warhead on a missile. The next step for that would be an atmospheric detonation over the Pacific, because North Korea does not possess dominions or territories that they can actually test this type of stuff. That would be a step too far for the world and for North Korea, and they know it. So in conjunction with the shift in the geopolitical situation with Trump coming in relative to the North Koreans' own domestic security requirements, and as James said, the sovereign security guarantee has always been central and fundamental to their aspirations in terms of negotiations. The second one to that would be the shift from an armistice to a peace treaty. They've always insisted on that as a secondary measure beyond their sovereign security. So we've had this change in dynamics in the past 18 months particularly. The preceding 4 or 5 years to that, when Kim came in, was the economic stability internally in the country. Another feature of nuclearization essentially would also be the downsizing of the military capacity of the country. At the moment, the military is, full size of the military is approximately 1.7 to 1.8 million troops, and then you have reserves on top of that. It's one of the largest standing armies in the world. Relative to the size of the country, it's massively disproportionate. That would actually release a lot of troops and finances back into the economy for internal economic development if they had a nuclear guarantee. Whether that nuclear guarantee comes from them themselves or they become part of a security arrangement, a security pact with perhaps China, it still means they can move in this economic direction and release people for development within the country. We have other, since 2014, dynamics coming into play on a geopolitical level. China's Silk Road and Belt has had a massive influence on their strategic thinking. The potential for North Korea to be involved in the Silk Road and Belt shouldn't be ignored. China realizes this. I'll get on to the summits in a moment and why the sequence of the summits is actually quite important to understand as well. But China's objective with its Silk Road and Belt is to have Atlantic to Pacific connectivity on the Eurasian continent. The missing link in that at the moment is North Korea, because China doesn't have a ice-free port. The next furthest up ice-free port is Vladivostok for 8 months of the year. The one before that is actually Rajin port in North Korea, and that actually connects with China's northern shipping aspirations, which they only announced in January in terms of inclusion within their broader globalization strategy. So the North Koreans understand their value in the food chain here, pertinent to China, and also Russia's connected to that Trans-Siberian route. It actually has an offshoot which goes to Rajin port to one. I've actually seen coal shipments coming from Russia to Rajin, which are being processed and then shipped to South Korea for their power stations. So there's been a lot of economic activity happening in the background over the years, which people are simply not aware of, which again is about perception, Western media perception, distortion of reality for whatever agendas. So if you jump forward to where we are now and how we've got here in the past few months, and the sequence in the summits to me is actually quite important, because obviously we had the first summit, which is China, North Korea. I've been reading reports over the past couple of weeks. First of all, there was absolute denial within Western media that it was actually taking place to begin with. And then when it was realized that Kim was actually in Beijing on this visit, then it was denial about what it was really about, and it was like China summons North Korea. China didn't summons North Korea. There was an open invitation for North Korea to attend since Kim came to power, and Kim activated that invitation himself and told China he was coming for these discussions. That's about positioning for both North Korea and China. Does it mean they're back to what they originally were? Not necessarily. They're being pragmatic in terms of their own positions, either position relative to this. So the next summit of interest was the China-South Korea dialogue. The next summit after that, which is actually happening, I believe, today or tomorrow, Russia and North Korea. We have Japan meeting with the US to line their ducks up. We have then probably Japan with South Korea. We'll have North Korea, South Korea, ultimately reaching the pinnacle, which is the US-North Korea dialogue. But the summits that are not taking place are also of interest. Where is the US-China summit on this? Where is the US-Russia summit on this? Obviously, the bigger geopolitical positions and posturing are blocking those summits from taking place. So it's really about a division between the 6 parties in the original series of talks and their positions on the dialogue moving forward. I see a different potential set of outcomes. I would limit to 3 potential sets of outcomes. 1, the dialogue goes absolutely nowhere. It just fails abysmally because the likes of John Bolton get involved and try and block it. Then the second scenario is that it goes the direction that people are totally not expecting it to go. Kim does commit to a program of denuclearization with caveats and guarantees in place. The third option is we go back to the status quo. And the status quo is about the geopolitical situation pertaining to Northeast Asia and essentially the military and strategic encirclement of Russia has always been the objective here. China in the past 30 years has become a secondary objective. Their rise took America by surprise, militarily particularly. So option A, B, or C, nothing really happens. Status quo remains, or it goes completely pear-shaped and the military option becomes back on the table again. The military option, as James pointed out, and other observers have pointed out, the physiology of North Korea would inhibit a successful bloody nose strike. And the North Koreans would not interpret a limited strike as an acceptable message of compliance for them. No, they would definitely take it the opposite. And no matter how you wish to convey that, it wouldn't come across the way it was supposed to come across. That's just ignorance in terms of the strategic thinking behind that. So on a personal level, I believe that the sequencing of these summits and the alignment of the various countries' regional and geopolitical interests will essentially lead to a position whereby North Korea will actually make a tangible offer with given assured guarantees of security, sovereign security, paramount, that could actually potentially lead to a process of verifiable denuclearization. But that's where I differ with James. I believe it is actually possible that that could happen as an outcome of this. It's really what I want to talk about for the past 6 years.
So the obvious question that leads from all this is, if there is a meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, where would it be?
I don't think it'll be in Pyongyang. It will certainly not be in the US. South Korea is probably not viable. Ulaanbaatar is a possibility, or maybe somewhere like Malaysia.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the North Koreans have been pushing hard for Pyongyang, and for obvious reasons, the Americans are pushing strongly back against it. And under any other president, that would be enough. It's just that Trump is such a contrarian that in the face of all this overwhelming advice from his advisors, one never knows what he will come up with. But I think that Ulaanbaatar would be a logical place because it's also accessible by Kim from North Korea.
Very much so. And the Mongolians are invested in North Korea as well. North Korea is invested in Mongolia. They're seen as a neutral arbitrator to a large extent. And to do it in Pyongyang would simply be construed as a propaganda win for North Korea.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, I agree. It's just Madeleine Albright actually went to North Korea in Pyongyang, and she went in 2000 in the last part of the last year of the Clinton presidency, and her experience, I think, is an illustration of what happens or what can happen if he was in fact to go to Pyongyang, because she found herself in a stadium and sort of a captive to this mass demonstration and mass show, and I think that and obviously the North Koreans in a meeting in Pyongyang would be in a position to not necessarily fix the agenda for the meeting, but fix all the things around the meeting. So that's certainly a reason why the Americans would not want to go, but the loose card in this is the president.
I would just add to that America was essentially caught in the back foot with the initiative which was proposed by Kim back in January in his New Year's speech. And it's accelerated significantly, obviously, with the involvement in the Winter Olympics and then the Paralympics, and where we've got to now is actually, in diplomatic terms, has been a rapid movement, much faster than people expected. So the Americans being caught in the back foot, they don't need or don't want to be caught any further behind the eight ball than what they've already been.
If you go back to Reagan and Gorbachev, they met in Iceland, which was in the middle of nowhere, very neutral. I mean, apart from Ulaanbaatar, where you've given how many other places are uninvolved and dispassionate, but would be prepared to offer good offices?
I think there's a limited number because there was some speculation, which I think wasn't. It was just speculation about Sweden, for instance, or even Switzerland. But I think for Kim, that would be a trip too far. I think that it's much more for him and for the North Koreans. If Pyongyang is out, then I think Ulaanbaatar would be the most likely thing. I think China and Russia are other possibilities, but I don't think either the North Koreans nor the Americans particularly would want to have it in those countries.
There's a wild card for you. What about Taiwan?
What?
Taiwan.
Yeah.
That would be the real wild card.
The other thing is that the President Moon and Kim are going to be meeting at the Peace House in the DMZ, but for security reasons, I don't think that's a venue that probably would be favored by either side, actually.
Right, there is a microphone there, so if you want to ask a question, hop up and get to it. As everybody races forward. Just whilst you're going to that, I'd like to ask a question about the Russians. The Foreign Minister Ri Yeng-ho has been in Moscow meeting with Sergei Lavrov at the moment, so it's not yet a summit. But there's speculation that Kim Jong-un might visit Moscow in early May and meet with Putin. So what kind of added complexity does that add to all the problems that we're trying to figure out, the mix, bringing the Russians in as well?
Do you want to go first?
Or do you think it's important to clear the decks with them? And
I think it's actually just sums it up nicely. It's important to clear the decks, and
yeah.
You remember the division between the 6 parties in terms of their alignment and orientation. Russia, China, North Korea have always been more closely aligned. So with China being the first, North Korea being the first summit, no surprise there whatsoever. Second summit being China and South Korea is something of a surprise, because you would have thought that potentially North Korea and Russia would have been the next summit to happen after that. Perhaps the groundwork is being laid now with this particular trip for that to happen, but how's it going to change things? Well, given the relationship between America and Russia at the moment, yes, it does bring in a dimension of complexity that I wouldn't be surprised if this summit is more subdued between Russia and North Korea to avoid a complicating factor being brought in with the Russia-American dynamic at the moment.
And I would think that going to the bargain, going to the negotiation table, going to the summit with Trump, that it is of use to him to have met certainly with the Chinese and then with the Russians. Although the Russians certainly don't have the influence in North Korea that the Chinese have, but certainly it strengthens marginally at least his hand, and also in the aftermath, depending on what happens at this summit, if the thing breaks down, then the issue becomes what happens to sanctions in some future period, especially if there's renewed military threats. So I think it's in this case Kim is getting his ducks in order for various possibilities. All right. Before I go to the floor, just one follow-on from that. At the moment, China and Japan are improving their relations. There's a diplomatic thaw. We're coming out of a very bad period. Is that part of this process, that they want to both be ready and not to be arguing amongst themselves over some islands when there's a possibility of some breakthrough in Korea, or is it just completely coincidental? I think they'll still be arguing about the.
Sorry?
I think they'll still be arguing about the islands.
Yeah, well, but they put it on hold. Yeah. That's the point. Yeah. They've been arguing about the islands forever.
As the South Koreans and Japanese are. But I think the Japanese, if the Americans were caught on the back foot by the approach by Kim in January, it was even more so for the Japanese.
Oh, very much so.
They feel marginalized by this process, and they're trying to get themselves back into the game.
I think also relative to that particular question, both North Korea and China are watching closely what happens in Japan politically. A change of leadership there could actually change the entire dynamic, as it did do with South Korea. Moon has changed a lot of things. Right. Abe going could actually change a lot of things.
Right. Philip.
Yeah, hi. Philip Sherwell from the Sunday Times. Thanks for 2 great presentations, very clear run-throughs of how we got to where we are and possible outcomes. I just wanted to ask Phil, your sort of final thought on the outcomes was that you thought that Kim actually might offer something significant or substantial or meaningful on denuclearization. And I just was interested if you could sort of expand on what that might be, given the different definitions of denuclearization anyway, and why he would offer something that might actually sort of be acceptable to the Americans or to Trump.
Well, it comes back to what they've had or not had to negotiate away in the first place. And as I said, they have yet to demonstrate the integration of all the component elements for the technology for nuclearization. They've got the separate elements of it. They have, in terms of missile technology, been integrated in that. Nuclearization, they've claimed to have miniaturized in the last test. Under the current situation, with the threat of potential war, a catastrophic war at that, they know themselves that would be the end of the regime. They understand the consequences for that. So they need to have something to negotiate away first. It really comes down to semantics in terms of what exactly it is they're negotiating away, because if they haven't demonstrated with a atmospheric detonation, which would be a step too far, if they haven't demonstrated, what do they have? Where's the evidence that they actually have it? So it would be better to negotiate away something you don't have or something you do have. It's, to me, that's what the position that they're at now and where they've wanted to get to. And that's why they accelerate the missile aspect of things, particularly over the past 18 months.
It's interesting because you've been there so often. I mean, are you now at the stage where you're just interpreting what you think they're thinking, or are you sort of relaying what you may have picked up?
Actually, mostly interpreting what I have been watching over the past number of years, particularly not what I'm being told by them. No, that's...
Peter Trainer. I'm a club member and a photographer. I have two questions for you, both separate. The first one is to both presenters. You both obviously spent a lot of time in North Korea and you're very familiar with what's going on there. The North Koreans have spent even more time there and they are pretty familiar with what's going on there. But the Americans haven't spent any time there and they've got no idea what's going on there. Are you concerned in your assessment of what's going to happen about the lack of knowledge that the Americans at the political level and at the leadership level actually have, and the bearing that that would have on the discussions? They don't have a track record, they don't have contacts. Do they have solid information to actually inform them to have a discussion with North Korea? And the second question is separate. That the Russians and the Chinese were at war with America and the United Nations during the Korean War, which has never ended. Does that situation, the fact that that the war isn't officially over, and the fact that Russia and China supported North Korea at that time, does that have a bearing on the summits that you're talking about now? Will the Chinese and Russian position be affected by the historical context, by the fact that they were at war and technically still are?
Well, perhaps I'll just respond to the first one. I think that the question of American expertise and diplomatic expertise and people who have knowledge and experience dealing with the Korean issue is a factor in preparing for the summit. Recently, there was a new American ambassador, or proposed American ambassador, Victor Cha, who was supposed to go to South Korea. He was an experienced National Security Council official from the first or second Bush administration, a specialist on North Korea. He his nomination was withdrawn in January because he reportedly opposed the bloody nose option. Recently, the special envoy for North Korea announced his retirement, just actually before this whole chain of summits got underway. And there has been, it's no secret, there's been a voting with their feet out of the State Department, huge departures from people in all areas of expertise, including North Korea. And it's also no secret that there's a total disdain in the White House and in Trump circles in Washington for diplomacy in general, and for the people who practice it. So I think it is a factor, and I think that one of the ways that it does factor in is being able to understand what the North Koreans are saying when they say something. And so if you had Victor Cha or other people who were experienced with North Korea, they could have told Trump that, in fact, when the North Koreans talk about denuclearization, there's also the second part about security guarantees. But instead, you don't get that interpretation. And as I mentioned earlier about what Trump had said on March the 11th about what he expected from this summit, and just yesterday he made another remark. He said hopefully we will be able to make a deal on the de-nuking of North Korea. They've said so. We've said so. Hopefully it will be a relationship that's much different than it's been for many years. We have a meeting that is being set up with North Korea. So that will be very exciting, I think, for the world. I think it is going to be a very exciting thing for the world. You know, it's his usual repeating things in different ways in the sentence. But I think that it goes back to your question of having the lack of experienced people around him who can actually decode what the North Koreans are saying. So I do think it's a factor.
So you are worried about it?
I think anybody who looks at the at this presidency and thinks of this president in that situation has to have some concerns. I mean, I think the fact is that we're in a situation, usually when you go into the summits, because you've had all this preparatory work, you know what the agenda is, you have an understanding of what the issues are and what the probable results are. Here, I think the probable outcomes go from A to Z. We don't know if it's going to be, well, as actually Philip has said, a stalemate, a blow up, or some deal. Who knows? Which is a very odd situation to be going into. And I think Dominic referred to the Gorbachev-Reagan thing, where Reagan agreed to things in Reykjavik without the advice of his people, which appalled the people around him. So I think you have that. You have a great potential for. There's a lot of unknowns about this summit, and I think just to go back to your question, I think you have two problems. You have the lack of people with knowledge about the situation, and you have a president who does not listen, who does not read, who does not study, who does not prepare. I think that's a potential recipe for a problem.
Yeah, I would just say that basically along those lines, the current administration is unpredictable in terms of how they're handling this whole situation. However, the precedents before that, we've had successive administrations working back through Obama, Bush to Clinton, who had every opportunity to engage in dialogue and discussion about resolution. They failed every time, and they were surrounded by a cortege of very intelligent, worldly people pertaining to this subject, but they choose not to, which brings you back to the original problem, which is the maintenance of the status quo. It served America's hegemonic agenda not to engage with North Korea, because otherwise it couldn't justify their presence in Northeast Asia for Russia and China. So, to go back to the North Korean position is one of sovereign security. Before they get this sovereign security point, as you say about the lingering open sore of the Korean War, which has never been resolved, it comes back to that question of the armistice over a peace treaty. And that has been something they've consistently asked for over the past 6 decades, and it's continuously, every time, been rebuked by the US. So that's a conscious decision not to engage.
And I think just to add to that, I mean, as far as the engagement goes, I think the precondition that the Americans had put on for any discussion with the North Koreans was unrealistic. This precondition that there would be this irreversible commitment to denuclearization. So I think the engagement, the talks, the fact that they're talking is a positive thing. President Trump just would be my first choice to be doing the talking. Yeah. I think that when you have a sequence of, we've talked about the sequence of summits involving different countries. There's also a sequence of meetings before summits that basically lay out the agenda and make sure that the thing doesn't blow up in the end. The other thing about Phil was right in terms of former presidents and their dealings and the fact that they've never been able to. There's been various attempts under Clinton, which continued under Bush and then ended, and then sort of started for a while under Obama to talk with the North Koreans, and for various reasons that ended. But part of the reason it ended was not because people weren't smart or they weren't informed. It was because this is a very, very difficult problem to resolve, that is very complicated, very complex. And so when you have President Trump saying yesterday, hey, they agree with this, I agree with this, we're going to do it. It sounds rather at odds with the experience of both past meetings between the North Koreans and the Americans and any other meetings that generally take place in the diplomatic sphere.
I'll just add one last point on, you specifically mentioned China and Russia and whether the history of the war and the armistice governs their thinking on things. All I was saying that is that not as much as it would have done 20 years ago. They're much more pragmatic now. The world has changed geopolitically. We're in a very different world to what we were 25 years ago. When America became the single hegemonic superpower in the world back in 1990s with the collapse of the Soviet Empire, that changed the dynamic. But they've had over 25 years now to prove themselves. And China and Russia are now looking at things in a different way. And will they let history govern their thinking now to the future? No, not to the extent that they would have done back in the 90s or the 80s.
I would say add one thing on China, though, that as much as China in the last few years has been annoyed at North Korea, it's even been more concerned about the idea of a failed state, of a collapsed state in North Korea, and with millions of North Koreans fleeing north because they could not flee south because of the minefields in the DMZ, so they'd be going north. Plus, you have U.S. armies at that point parked up on the Chinese border. That's been sort of a nightmare scenario for the Chinese.
Status quo.
Before I go to the next question, as you say, technically the state of war continues since, what is it, 1954? Is that?
53.
53. So, I mean, it's gone on forever. There have been incidents. Ships have been sunk, and there was the Pueblo incident. But isn't declaring peace the obvious starting point for any further talks about denuclearization and everything? At least that's one thing that's actually quite easy. Both sides could unilaterally agree, yes, we can have peace. And that's a win-win, so that they could walk away from the meeting with one thing up that actually doesn't change. You can always redeclare war if you want, but I mean, it doesn't change the situation on the ground. Everything remains there, but at least in theory, you're no longer at war, and that's a step forward. Is that a possibility, or is that too simplistic?
It's a bit between. I mean, there's a difference between declaring a war and ending a war. What's happened here is a war was never ended. To declare a new war on top of that. All
right, forget declaring it. We're talking about stopping something, this historical legacy.
Yeah, I think that'll be like the second key point on the North Korean agenda.
So it will come after denuclearization?
I think
it would be secondary to
it'll
that.
come after the sovereign security guarantees. Once they get the sovereign security guarantees, then the peace aspect of it, yeah.
And that goes to the point of the advice that the president will be getting, because the issue of the end to the war has been, a peace declaration has been raised, as Philip said, repeatedly by the North Koreans, officially and unofficially, for decades. But there's a history of why the Americans have not been amenable to that. And I wonder, when Trump gets into the room, whether he will be, to what extent he will be aware or even care about that history.
Exactly, so, that's a good point.
And is he acting in that room because he's made a decision that, yes, he knows the history and he decided to go another way, or he's acting because he actually doesn't know the history and doesn't know what the policy is and
but
why.
I mean, just go back to Gorbachev and Reagan. As you said, Reagan made decisions around that log fire, and they decided that they would go for a better world between them. So,
and then they
backed, such a bad thing?
And then they backed away.
Yeah.
Afterwards, when he went back to Washington.
Okay. So. Right. Question.
Hi, my name is Goff, a student from Thailand. I just have a question about Japan. We know that Trump will meet Prime Minister Abe on April 17, and I know that Japan worry a lot about a lot of things about North Korea. For example, there are the past 17 abductions of the Japanese citizens by North Korea, and also the unclear message about the denuclearization because when we talk about, we are not clear about the word denuclearization, whether it's just intercontinental range missile or it include the medium and short range too. I think this is worry make Japan worry about the security. And yeah, my question is it after the meeting with the Trump, is it possible that for the trilateral meeting between Japan, US, and North Korea?
Well, I think one of the things the Chinese would like to do is to go back at some point to the six-party talks, which involves both Japan and North Korea, United States, as well as Russia and South Korea. So there's an existing mechanism which has been dormant for several years. But I know that in Japan, the case of the abductions is a major issue, or the major issue with North Korea, and it's a very sad business. But I think that is probably something that will eventually be the subject of North Korea-Japanese contacts and dialogue, as it was a few years ago when former Prime Minister Koizumi went to North Korea to address that issue, and there was some movement at a certain point in the early part of the century.
Just very quickly on the strategic orientation, Japan falling within range of short to medium term missiles. Yep, absolutely. The impact of that, geopolitical, the supply chain for most of the technology, chips, etc., that could be massively disrupted, have a huge impact globally, not just in Japan, but globally. So yes, in answer to your question, they definitely fall within the range, and as a major consideration, it's more likely actually that they would use short to medium range missiles on specific locations in Japan if it did come to conflict. And obviously South Korea would be a major target, but economically they understand the value of Japan within the technological food chain. So yeah, it would definitely become a target. And just to say something on the abduction issue, yes, it is a burning thorn for Japan in terms of 17 outstanding abductees still unaccounted for, perhaps. Some of them may be dead. It also is convenient for Japan to cover its own dark history pertaining to the repatriation, forced repatriation of ethnic mixed Korean Japanese citizens to North Korea during the early utilitarian years of North Korea after the Korean War, which was facilitated by the Russians as well. So the Japanese are not very quick to talk about that little episode of their history.
Question?
I have a question about how all of these goings on and upcoming negotiations, et cetera, are affecting the development assistance programs, which have been going on in North Korea for a number of years, many of them through European Union NGOs. What has been the effect of the sanctions and the effect of what's happening now on this development these development assistance programs?
That's one I'm quite familiar with this one. Actually, it's having a significant impact on many of the organizations' ability to deliver the services that they're committed to deliver. It's not that they can't get the goods into the country and stuff like this, it's getting paid for it because they're paying for it in US dollars. And it's the interpretation of the sanctions that is the problem here. And the interpretation of those potential breaches of sanctions has been extended to banks that deal with US banks, particularly in Europe. If they're seen to be facilitating payments to North Korea, then they're potentially sanctioned. So therefore, they simply don't facilitate the payments. And that's where your fundamental problem lies. And that's the impact it's having across the supply of aid and whatnot. So it is a major problem.
Yeah, and I would add that actually there are 6 UN agencies that work in North Korea. World Food Program and UNICEF are 2 of them. World Food Program has a major feeding program for under 5-year-olds, nutrition for under 5-year-olds in orphanages and schools in about 1/3 of the provinces. And they also provide money for nutrition for lactating mothers and for pregnant women. And they have a tremendous problem in, as Phil said, in actually getting money into the country, because they're affected by sanctions, even though they're UN agencies, because of the bank situation. They also have a problem with donors. So they're underfunded. So basically how these agencies work, they go out to the international community like WFP, they'll go out to the international community and seek funding. And of course, countries are also, the same agencies are seeking funding for their programs in Africa and wherever in the world. And so they're competing against all these other places. And when you consider the complications that a lot of countries have in dealing with the North Korean issue, unsurprisingly, a lot of them are reluctant to get very involved. But the WFP, for instance, is supported by a number of countries, continues to be in North Korea, including by Canada, Scandinavian countries, and a range of other EU countries. But it has been a major issue, and at a certain point, some agencies have considered whether they can continue to operate there because of the problem with funding.
But
yeah, and they're not exactly funding the military in terms of the food programs. They're funding like starving children and whatnot. So
But
yeah, these are funding programs for under 5-year-olds, from infant to
in addition to the UN agencies, there are also international NGOs like Save the Children that have been there for a number of years, no longer called Save the Children, but I think European Desk #1 or something. And so you're saying they're seriously impacted by sanctions, by what's going on.
Yeah, I think that I just mentioned the UN agencies because you think the UN agencies would be able to move their funds, but they have an impact on them, a serious impact, and so do the NGOs even more so. There's also, and the agencies also, and this goes to the question of what is the situation in North Korea for the people who work there from the outside. And the agencies have varying sort of relationships with the North Korean authorities, and some of them are what they describe as quite constructive relationships with them, particularly, for instance, the WFP, and to be able to distribute these nutritional food supplements to a wide variety of children in a wide variety of the country.
That was Christine Monroe asking the question. Yes. Yeah. Can you just identify yourself so that people...
Hi, my name is Danica Blacklock. I'm a consultant with UNDP. My question tags on to the previous one related to sanctions. I've done a lot of work on sanctions and countries under sanctions in the past, particularly conflict-related countries. In my experience, the last time they were effective was 1994 in South Africa. How, you look at Bosnia, you look at all the various other countries, you look at North Korea specifically, and the fact that, it seems like every other week in the past few months, they're identifying countries or companies in various countries which have been, going around the sanctions, Singapore, no less, to get goods or services or money, what have you, to North Korea. And so in relation to the previous question, where sanctions are having a large impact on the delivery of development services, how much of an impact do you feel that it may or may not have had on bringing the regime, for lack of a better term, to this pushing the U.S. to the point where Trump has agreed to negotiate or to at least discuss some of the issues?
Well, you can't underestimate the resiliency of the North Korean people and their attitude, which is obviously governed by their philosophy, the Juche philosophy of self-reliance. They have learned to deal with sanctions over the years because they've been relentless and unforgiving. But it's the interpretation of those sanctions, in my opinion, which is the biggest problem, because there's many countries that trade with North Korea, and they're not doing anything illegal. They're supplying goods, clothing, household goods, etc., etc. This is what's been hit and targeted with the sanctions at the moment. And the elevation of the propaganda against the country pertaining to trade, general trade, in the past year or year and a half particularly, is actually starting to have an impact on people. And that's what the sanctions are targeting. These sanctions are targeting regime change. They're not targeting denuclearization, because if we're targeting denuclearization, they've kind of failed. They've actually accelerated in spite of the sanctions. So what are the sanctions really about? They're about targeting the people. So they're targeting general trade, even food. So.
And I think in the last few months of 2017, you saw China actually going beyond even the UN sanctions, and I think that would have had an influence on the North Korea in the sense of their timetable for Kim's statement in January. But I would return to my earlier statement that you know, when you look at the developments since January, Kim is getting, if he gets this meeting with Trump, he's getting to the table where he's always wanted to be, and where his father wanted to be, with a meeting with the U.S. president. So sanctions may have accelerated that process, but the end result is a significant achievement for North Korean foreign policy in getting the meeting in the first place. But I think in terms of the sanctions before the most recent sort of Chinese, I think, enforcement or reinforcement of the sanctions, the thing that Phil said about being a resilient economy, or a resilient people, it's also a resilient economy in the sense that a lot of it is still agricultural. And so, you know, it takes some time for the sanctions to go through to the countryside. And the city, until recently, at least in Pyongyang, for instance, the 1%, which is certainly visible in Pyongyang, have been protected from the sanctions in the sense that these goods have continued to come in, the luxury goods, in one form or the other, because you see them there, and you see them on the shelves. But I think my concern has been more with what is the impact on ordinary people, and that's why I go back to the UN agencies, which are trying to help these people, and especially small people, in this case children and infants, and the impact that it's had on them, and it has had an impact on that.
I'll just add one thing, that the agriculture part of it's actually quite important, because in terms of the capacity of the country to produce food for itself, they're actually quite effective. Their failing is actually harvesting that food in time before it's wasted. And that's why they always deploy tens of thousands of troops, and the people march out from the cities to the towns to help with the harvesting, because they're being hit with oil. They don't have mechanized means to gather and harvest, and this is why they need aid. So by hitting the oil sanctions, that's actually going beyond, that's really targeting people, the poorest people.
I would say as well that in terms of the North Korean economy, there's been a significant shift in the North Korean economy since the 1990s. In the 1990s, in 94, 95, after the end of the Soviet Union and the end of Russian subsidies, there was widespread starvation in North Korea. And so there was a development at that point, because the regime could not feed its own people, there was a development of unofficial markets. And those have just expanded over the years to both, there's official and there's unofficial, but our estimates are about 70% of the population is active in the markets. And it's interesting because the markets tend to be, the vendors tend to be women. So that's sort of changed the dynamics in the society as well, and in families, because the men tend to be working for the state or state enterprises and have a fixed salary, and the women may be working as a vendor in a marketplace with not a fixed income, but with an income which changes the dynamics within within the North Korean family itself. So I've often characterized, if you look at North Korea now, politically it reminds me of this, in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union in the, say, the 1930s, 1940s. Economically, it looks more like China in the early 1980s. So there's a significant development going on economically. And, you know, the South Koreans, for instance, are well versed in this because they get a continuing flow of people from North Korea who make their way to South Korea. And there's very interesting information on an ongoing basis about what's happening in the economy and in the society.
Actually, I totally support what James said about the markets and whatnot. I refer to them as the shadow markets. People call them the black market, the grey market. That implies that it goes against the government. The government doesn't support it. The government absolutely support these. They have to support them. If they didn't support them, the country would have imploded a long time ago. And the observation about the women in the markets, absolutely correct. And I can tell you that the women working those markets, the majority of them, actually all of them, not one of them under 45 years old. They're all over 45 years old. And that's because it provides a means of income and sustaining themselves. It creates jobs, essentially. They trade for themselves. Well.
It's also interesting that when you go into the countryside, if you go outside of the cities and you go into the countryside, you see a lot of people on the move carrying goods, and a lot of these goods are being carried to and from markets, and people on the side of the road selling goods. I mean, it's very interesting, this urban-rural divide in Pyongyang too, which is very marked, like it is in developing countries.
Same in China. I can show you some videos if you're interested in some of these markets, actually.
That'd be great. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank
Right. One of the few North Koreans in the room tonight, Mira Kim.
Thank you. Well, my question is very simple. Both panelists, have you watched a documentary entitled Christmas Cargo?
No, I haven't watched that documentary.
No, never mind, because that was taken in 1951 too by, there was a cargo ship to Hungnam port.
Oh yes.
Yes.
I know this story.
Right,
yes. Yeah.
right. It was beautiful, kind of. And Moon Jae-in's parents were from that ship down to, supposed to go to Bhutan, but it didn't. It went to Koje Island.
And it was a usually overloaded ship with people. Yeah.
Moon Jae-in, he speaks South Korean, that dialect, that part of dialect perfectly, but he's from Hungnam. His parents are from Hungnam. Never mind. The second thing is, well, I just thought about this sanctions and then vetoes at the Security Council. You know, I mean, that was actually not a question. The next question is, have any of you seen the performance by South Korean contemporary musicians in Pyongyang on the 1st of April?
Yes.
Yes.
Velvet.
Right. That was
red velvet.
That was remarkable. And my last thing is about Kim Jong-nam's son in his early 20s, speaking English excellently, somewhere in Nordic country, but I would like to know where he is.
So that's the son of the murdered half-brother. Right?
Well, Kim Jong-nam was murdered in KL airport.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No idea where he is, frankly.
And he's not advertising where he is anyway.
No, I would imagine not.
I would guess. Right. Jim Pringle.
I think I was going to ask something pretty much the same as the lady just now. Kim Jong-un has killed his uncle, his favorite uncle, and had his half-brother murdered by 2 innocent girls. It's like, it must be like watching a play by Shakespeare's Macbeth. How can we accept a man like this who can kill his closest family and trust him in any way?
Well, I thought it was interesting, the woman who spoke previously about President Moon being himself from a refugee family from North Korea. And I think that in South Korea you have a lot of people who are in that situation, who suffered tremendously because of the war and because of the political circumstances, but make a decision, like President Moon, to sort of rise above it and move on. And I think that that's what he's done. And I think that you know, he knows the history of the regime in North Korea, and there are, you know, but the other thing is that North Korea, you know, is not unique, I would say, in terms of countries around the world. You know, if we were only to deal with, and if we were only to negotiate with countries which meet our standards, we wouldn't be doing much negotiating.
Yes, but these people don't have atom bombs.
Well, I think that's the issue. That's why I think, you know, it goes to the point of why President Trump is actually meeting with him. Do you really think he'd be meeting?
Should he be doing that?
Well, but do you think he'd be meeting with him if he didn't have these weapons? Would anybody be meeting with him?
Should the Queen of England meet with a serial killer called Martin McGuinness and shake his hand? I don't see many complaints about that these days.
Do you think that the whole issue of nuclear weapons is rather exaggerated? Because, I mean, it's extremely difficult to build up a serious arsenal that could do lots of damage. I acknowledge that one hit on a Japanese population centre would be disastrous, but I mean, there's no sign that they're actually very good, their weapons. If you remember the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein, we were all terrified of these Scud missiles that turned out to be flying dustbins that basically were pretty nasty if they hit you, but hopeless. But going back to what happened in Kuala Lumpur, is that not a much more serious concern that these guys have got VX and that they used it in an airport terminal in a country that was actually very friendly to them? They had a special relationship with Malaysia, you know, free visas and everything. Is it not a concern that something like VX is in their hands and can be deployed all over the world relatively easily?
Yeah, well, as we saw from
Salisbury.
As we saw from, yeah, exactly, Salisbury, it's not only the, you know, it's not exclusive to one country or the other. I think the reality is that engagement, I mean, we have a choice. You either have engagement or you have isolation. I don't think isolation does a great deal to that doesn't assist in dealing with the human rights issues that the gentleman has raised. I think that the experience with various countries in the world is that countries have to be dealt with as a whole, and the only way you basically address human rights concerns ultimately is to engage in one form or the other with those countries. Isolation doesn't really work, except in, you know, there have been specific cases, I suppose, in South Africa and whatnot, but that's not generally been the historical experience. So I think it's important I think in dealing with North Korea, if you set aside the nuclear issue for a moment and you look at that, I think that there is something to be gained from looking at the experience in dealing with the Soviet Union in the 1970s and the 1980s, when there was an attempt to engage the Soviets by Western countries, exchange of scholars, exchange of artists, to basically try to influence the next generation. So I think that the experience there is something that can be potentially of use in terms of the future in North Korea. But certainly the human rights issues that you raise and Dominic mentioned on the Malaysian cases are very important. But I think that ultimately they can only be addressed in a process of engagement.
I would agree. There's not very much I want to say on that other than.
But do you think the VX is a bigger threat than the nuclear threat?
Depends who's framing it for what purpose. I mean, VX, nerve agent, as a singular assassination tool, doesn't really make much sense.
Well, it's completely bizarre.
It is bizarre.
And I think to go to this threat, in terms of the South Koreans, they've been living under a threat for decades, under the threat of bombardment by conventional weapons of Seoul. So to them, the issue of the development of nuclear weapons I think is a different dimension than it is for perhaps for Americans, for instance, looking at that situation.
Jim, did you want to follow?
Yeah, I've only been to North Korea 2 or 3 times. I don't have anything like the experience that you have. But I find it, in many ways, it's a nicer country than South Korea. The people are more kind and friendly. What is your feeling about that?
Well, very friendly, very nice people, very accommodating. Yeah, and it's also one of the safest countries I work in.
I'd just like to ask on that question. I mean, there's always this, it's about the foreign media and the coverage, but there's always this tendency in the foreign media to beat up the madcap element. There's lots of very humorous stories that come out of North Korea, and kind of cultural misunderstanding stories, but, you know, the girl bands with the rockets going off in the background, which is just so bizarre it's beyond belief. Do you think the Western media does a good job on North Korea? And if not,
Hatchet job,
obviously
maybe.
don't. But if not, where is it going wrong?
They do an atrocious job in North Korea, and I don't know where they get their information from, frankly. It's a terrible job.
Where are they reporting it from? Mainly Seoul?
Or Seoul, Washington, whatever. But there's it's just complete misunderstanding, misperception.
Right.
I mean, I have solid evidence and information of economic developments, and I've shown it to people before, and they've looked at it and said, like, no, it's fabricated.
Yeah.
It's interesting with the media, because I know a lot of the media in South Korea who cover North Korea from there, and for the most part they go on occasional visits to North Korea. But when they go en masse, for instance, during one of the party conferences a couple of years ago, then the North Koreans don't know how to deal with them en masse. Because somebody in the North Korean hierarchy invited all these journalists to come, but then when they got there, they were sort of corralled and herded, and they didn't know what to do with them, because that was no longer his responsibility. He passed it on to somebody else who really didn't want them there. So I think it's sort of mismatch, in the sense that what happens in that situation is the journalists start reporting on each other, because they're all in a corral, and so BBC is reporting on what the New York Times reporter is doing, and vice versa, because they're basically aren't allowed out of the. It's
a bit like quoting compound. The taxi driver in from the airport. You know, no reporting has been done. Sorry, go on.
We're as alien to the North Koreans as they are to us in many respects, in terms of the media coverage and propaganda and everything. I mean, I've seen them in Beijing and different places, and believe me, they're mesmerized by some things we wouldn't think twice of.
Have you seen any good reporting? Is there anything that's encouraging? Any good analysis?
Yeah, there is some good analysis out there. There's some pretty good organisations that do have reliable sources of information, but again, it's how it's interpreted, what the agenda is behind it. I mean, NK News is very good in terms of the...
Which one? NHK?
NK News.
NKU.
Yeah. I mean, they're quite good in terms of their sources and assets and whatnot. But again, most of the mainstream media, they don't have an agenda of engagement in terms of accuracy of information. Like when Jiang was executed, he was fed to the dogs. Yeah, okay. That started as a spoof blog by a Chinese blogger, And it was identified and verified as a spoof blog, but yet no, it was carried by Western media, and still people carry it to this day. Yeah. And he was executed for corruption. It wasn't a purge. He was filthily corrupt. And they have a death penalty for that in the country, as China does.
And he was executed normally? Or?
Normal, standard execution, not dogs.
Not dogs.
Not dogs.
But it was interesting how that story, because yeah, as you say, it started on a blog in China. It was picked up by a Chinese or a Hong Kong newspaper, and then picked up by the Hong Kong newspaper,
and then went to ours and bang.
And still,
it's fact.
Still shows up on people's comments about.
Right. Well, an interesting night, I must say. Thank you very much, James and Phil, for coming and filling us in on a black hole in regional coverage, I have to admit. Next week, I'm fairly sure we're doing motorcycle taxis in Bangkok and the politics that go with them. They're a very interesting part of the community, much more active than you would imagine. And that's on the 18th, which is next Wednesday. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.